Hello, and welcome back to Dark Crimes Real.
November 2nd, 2025. At the State Correctional Institution, Phoenix, in Pennsylvania, George Emil Banks took his final breath. He was 83 years old. The man responsible for one of the worst family massacres in American history died alone, behind concrete walls that had contained him for more than 4 decades. There was no funeral, no visitors, no family left to claim his body. Authorities listed the cause of death as kidney cancer. But for many who still remember the horror of 1982, his real cause of death had been written long ago in the screams of the 11 souls he took that morning. For years, Banks lived in near silence. His mind had decayed under layers of paranoia and delusion, the same mind that once convinced him that killing was mercy. He outlived his victims, his sentence, and even the justice system that once condemned him. Some said it was fitting that the man who destroyed his own bloodline would die with no one left to mourn him. Others said it was just another tragedy, the end of a life that began broken and never found peace. In the records of Pennsylvania's prisons, a single line now closes his story. Case closed, November 2025. But to understand how a father of 13 turned into a killer, how fear, hatred, and delusion merged into an act beyond reason, we must go back to the morning of September 25th, 1982. George Emil Banks was born in 1942 in the industrial city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. His life began as a conflict he never chose, the son of a black father and a white mother at a time when that union itself was considered a crime in many places across America. From childhood, he lived between two worlds that both rejected him. Black children mocked his light skin. White children called him slurs he never forgot. He grew up believing he belonged nowhere. In his 20s, Banks drifted between jobs and bars, angry and restless. A robbery conviction in 1961 sent him to prison, where he served several years before being released. Ironically, that same system later hired him. He became a prison guard, enforcing the very rules that once confined him. Colleagues described him as quiet, unpredictable, a man who stared too long. But behind that silence, paranoia was growing. Banks began speaking of conspiracies, of a government that controlled minds, of people plotting against him. He told friends that a racial war was coming and that mixed-race people would be the first to die. By the late 1970s, his private life had become chaos. He lived with several white women, fathered multiple children, and moved between homes filled with arguments and poverty. Neighbors recalled hearing him preach that his children were chosen, special, yet doomed by society. It was the beginning of a dangerous delusion, the belief that he could save them only by taking them away from the world itself. And as the tension in his mind deepened, the line between protection and destruction began to disappear. By 1982, the cracks in George Banks's mind had become canyons. He had lost his job as a prison guard. He was drowning in debt, surrounded by women who no longer trusted him, and children he could barely feed. At night, he stayed awake, pacing through rooms filled with clutter, muttering to himself about the system. He believed the government was watching him, that they were coming to take his children away because they were mixed race. He said they would be turned into slaves of a white world. Friends who visited him in the summer of 1982 later described his eyes as vacant. He carried weapons everywhere. He had begun drinking heavily and smoking marijuana almost daily, which only fed the voices in his head. In late September, one of his girlfriends told him she planned to leave and take the children with her. Something inside Banks snapped. He ranted that the apocalypse was near, that the only way to protect his family was to save them from this evil world. The night before the killings, he drank until sunrise. Neighbors heard loud arguments, crying children, and finally, silence. By dawn, Banks was sitting alone in his car, an AR-15 rifle beside him, a military jacket over his shoulders. In his own mind, he wasn't preparing for murder. He believed he was preparing for salvation. And before the sun rose over Wilkes-Barre, the nightmare would begin. It was still dark when George Banks began his killing. 2:30 a.m., September 25, 1982. A quiet Saturday in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Most of the town was asleep. Inside the small house at 1310 School Street, 8 people lay resting, his girlfriends, their children, and his own. Banks had spent the night drinking and talking to himself about salvation. Now he moved through the rooms with an AR-15 rifle and a .45 pistol. He fired in short bursts, methodical, steady, unhurried. When the first shot echoed, neighbors thought it was a car backfiring. In the living room, his girlfriend Dorothy Lyons was the first to die. Then 29-year-old Regina Clemens, who had tried to shield her little boy. One by one, he shot his children, Montezuma, Kismayu, and Mauritania, all under 6 years old. When police later asked him why, Banks said he wanted to save them from the cruelty of the world. The rampage didn't stop there. Before dawn, he got into his car and drove 5 miles to Jenkins Township. There, at the Heather Highlands Mobile Home Park, another of his former girlfriends, Sharon Mazzillo, lived with their young son, her mother, and her brother. He parked quietly outside, walked in through the unlocked door, and opened fire again. Sharon fell first, followed by her mother Alice and then her brother Scott. His 3-year-old son was last. 13 victims in total, 5 of them his own children. The youngest, just 23 months old. By sunrise, the neighborhood was chaos. Residents who had woken to gunfire were hiding in basements, calling police from behind locked doors. Officers from Luzerne County and the Pennsylvania State Police raced to the scene, tracing the car back to Banks's mother's house. There, they found him pacing near a window, armed and speaking incoherently about the end of days. Negotiators tried for hours. He shouted about the government, about enemies, about voices that told him to act. Then, at 10:30 a.m., he walked out of the house, empty-handed, calm, his voice flat. He said, "I killed them. I killed them all." No one fired. The officers just stood there, frozen, surrounded by silence so heavy it felt sacred. The massacre was over. But in the days to come, investigators would discover something even darker than the crime itself. The twisted beliefs that had convinced George Banks that murder was mercy. After his arrest, George Banks was strangely calm. He sat in a small interrogation room at the Wilkes-Barre Police Headquarters, his hands still trembling, his eyes distant. When detectives asked why, his answer was chillingly simple. They were better off dead. The world was too cruel for them. He claimed he loved his children, that he killed them to save them from a society that would never accept them. To the officers, it sounded like madness. To Banks, it was logic. In his mind, the world had turned against him long before that night. He believed the government was planning to destroy mixed-race families, that secret organizations were watching him through windows, that his girlfriends were part of the plot. Every day fed his paranoia, the racial slurs, the unemployment, the loneliness. He convinced himself that death was the only escape left for his children. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and psychotic delusions, a mind fractured by fear and isolation. One doctor testified that Banks believed he was a messenger of God, chosen to protect his bloodline from corruption. Another described him as trapped inside a universe of persecution, where love and violence had become the same thing. During the trial, Banks often interrupted his own lawyers. He insisted that he was sane, that he acted under divine instruction. God told me what to do. I saved them. He never expressed guilt, never cried, never once referred to his children by name. It was as if he had already separated himself from humanity. Experts later classified his case as a rare form of altruistic filicide, a parent killing out of a delusional belief that death will protect the child. But in George Banks's version, it went far beyond that. His paranoia had turned into prophecy, and when prophecy met despair, it became a massacre. Even in the decades that followed, prison staff reported that Banks never changed his story. He spoke rarely, but when he did, he still insisted he had saved them. The delusion never left him. It simply grew quieter, locked away behind concrete walls. By the time the courts reviewed his mental state years later, doctors agreed George Banks was not faking insanity. He was living in it. And while justice demanded punishment, the law soon faced an impossible question. Could a man who no longer understood his own crimes truly face death? The trial of George Emil Banks began in June 1983 at the Luzerne County Courthouse. Security was tight. Outside, crowds gathered every morning, some demanding his execution, others calling for psychiatric treatment instead. Inside the courtroom, Banks sat motionless. He wore glasses, a dark suit, and an expression that never changed. As the prosecution described the scene on School Street and at Heather Highlands, he simply stared at the floor. When the photographs of the children were shown, jurors cried. Banks did not. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistic matches, eyewitness testimony, his own confession. The question was not whether he killed them, but whether he understood what he had done. Psychiatrists argued over his sanity. The defense claimed he was deeply psychotic, detached from reality. The prosecution countered that his actions were calculated. He reloaded, drove between locations, and spared certain people. To them, it was proof of awareness. After 3 weeks, the jury reached its verdict: guilty on 12 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of third-degree murder. The sentence, death. But even then, the story didn't end. Over the following decades, Banks's mental health collapsed further. He spent most of his time in isolation at the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections Psychiatric Unit. He heard voices, refused medication, and often spoke of messages from God. Doctors described him as psychotic and delusional beyond comprehension. In 2004, Pennsylvania scheduled his execution, yet only days before, a federal court halted it, ruling that he was mentally incompetent to be put to death. The same state that had condemned him now declared he no longer understood the meaning of punishment. By 2010, Banks was permanently removed from death row. He was transferred to a secure hospital wing within the State Correctional Institution system, where he spent his final years under constant observation. He rarely spoke, ate little, and seemed unaware of time. To guards and doctors alike, he was a ghost, a man whose body survived long after his mind had died. For more than 40 years, George Banks lived in silence, a prisoner not only of the state, but of his own delusion. And in 2025, that silence would finally be broken. 43 years after the massacre, the story of George Emil Banks came to a quiet end. On November 2, 2025, at the State Correctional Institution, Phoenix, in Pennsylvania, he was pronounced dead at 2:17 a.m. The official cause? Complications from kidney cancer. He was 83 years old. There was no announcement, no family, no memorial service. The Department of Corrections released a single-line statement. Inmate George E. Banks, sentenced to death in 1983, has died of natural causes. No one came to claim the body, no next of kin, no surviving relatives. The man who once took 13 lives, including 5 of his own children, had outlived everyone who might have spoken his name. His remains were cremated according to prison protocol, the ashes placed in an unmarked container. No prayers, no flowers, no visitors. Just a number in a file, a statistic closing one of Pennsylvania's darkest chapters. For those who remembered the case, the news felt distant, almost unreal. He had existed so long in the background, a ghost from another century, preserved in headlines and legal archives. The world had moved on. The homes on School Street were gone, the trailer park rebuilt, the families scattered. Only the memory remained. In the end, the man who believed he was saving his children had destroyed everything that connected him to life itself. He outlived his victims, his sentence, and his sanity. And finally, he met the only peace left for him: silence. But for the people of Wilkes-Barre, and for every family scarred by what he did, silence was never the same again. This was more than the story of a murderer. It was the story of a man broken by a world that refused to accept him. George Emil Banks was born in the shadow of division between black and white, love and rejection, sanity and madness. He carried those lines inside him until they tore him apart. Nothing justifies what he did. The horror he created cannot be measured or excused. But his life stands as a warning of what hatred, isolation, and silence can do to a human mind. For decades, he believed the world had no place for him, and in the end, he proved himself right by destroying the only place he ever belonged. We cannot rewrite what happened on that September morning, but we can learn from the world that made it possible. A world where color still defines worth, where people are still made to feel less because they were born different. To anyone who still feels trapped between two worlds, don't let hate define who you are. Don't let fear make you destroy what you love. Be proud of your color. Be proud of your story. And know that your life matters, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. Because every time prejudice wins, humanity loses. And every time we choose understanding over hate, we keep tragedies like this from happening again.